Here.
I know Jean's here. Jean's here. I just saw her.
Okay. All right. She'll be back. Okay, next section here would be a public comment for items not on tonight's agenda. Okay, seeing none. Next item is the adoption of tonight's agenda. So can we have a motion to adopt tonight's agenda?
I move.
I second.
Okay, all in favor? Aye. Okay, motion passes. Let's see. All right. Next item is, I'm kind of thinking about where Jean is. We saw her. She disappeared. Okay. I think we can move through the consent agenda. Okay. So any public comment on tonight's consent agenda, which consists of the project status update, Public Works project update, and draft minutes for November 19th. Okay, seeing no public comment, do we have a motion to approve tonight's agenda?
I so move.
I second.
Okay, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, consent agenda passes. Okay, the next item is item number 4, be the general plan update.
Mr. Chairman, before we launch into the to that item, I should have spoke up during public comment probably, but I did want to note for the commission, we have some council members here as well, and then for the folks on the that are watching live, today is actually the 35th anniversary of the Townsend Corporation, and so we have apple cider in the back. We've got some special cookies that were made celebrating the 35th anniversary that Carol's going to butt into here in a second. And so we just wanted to recognize that for the commission before we start.
Okay, thank you. Do we need to take a little break so we can grab some coffee real quick? Or?
It might be a good idea if you want to do that.
All right.
I want cookies.
Okay.
Cookies.
I
Why
second
don't, Carol, did you said you had, he said you had something to, or somebody did? No?
Do you have to vote on that?
Okay. All right, we'll take a 5-10 minute break. And there's some refreshments in the back. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start with its item number 4, General Plan Update 2020. Britt, our town engineer, go ahead, please.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to kind of bring traffic, some of the issues that I deal with all the time. I appreciate the opportunity to kind of get up and explain some of what's going on and kind of what I do and how things get built. So tonight we're going to talk about the circulation element of the general plan. It's just one component of the general plan. I like to think of it as the most important part of the general plan, but truly it's not. It's just a part of the puzzle. It's just one piece of this this large puzzle that is the general plan. And like all the other elements of the general plan, it needs to be updated because things change. The situations change, the requirements change, people's behavior changes. So we need to constantly update it. And we do periodically update the circulation element, probably about every 4 or 5 years. So we do it a little more often than other elements of the general plan. But it is an ongoing evolution, I guess you'd say. So, like I said, it's just part of the general plan. It has, when we're looking at the circulation element, we have to also be looking at all of the other elements as we're preparing it. We have to look at the housing, the land use and zoning, the existing circulation element, public health and safety, air quality, noise, all of these other elements need to go into the general plan or to the circulation element because we need to figure out how to get people from where they live to where they work, to where they do recreation, where they shop. So, the circulation element, it is a plan for the future. It is looking at what we have and planning for how we're going to move people through town. We have to take into all the considerations here of how we build it, the existing road network, what we want our future road network to look like. We also have to figure out how we're going to meet state and federal requirements. The state and federal requirement, or the state and federal government give us a lot of requirements for how we move people and how a circulation element's going to work. It also sets our standards. We get to pick what our road widths are going to be, what type of bike trails, bike lanes, sidewalks, how we want to move. There is kind of a new, or I don't want to say new, but there, as people think about how to get to the store, a lot of people are thinking of healthy alternatives of walking. So we want to make sure that we're providing sidewalk or bike trails for people to get from their house to the store, to the grocery store, because maybe they want to start walking to that, or maybe they want to bike to it. Maybe they want a healthier lifestyle. We need to make sure that we're looking at that type of infrastructure when we're updating our circulation element. So we also want to talk about a level of service. The LOS, or the level of service, is the way we used to evaluate projects. And the level of service basically is how long are you going to wait at a signalized intersection or a stop-controlled intersection. The length of time that you're sitting there, if you're able to just come up to the intersection and go through it, and you're not delayed more than 4 or 5 seconds, that's a level of service A. If you're waiting 20 seconds, maybe that's a level of service B. 20 to 35 seconds is a C, and so on. D to an F would be a failure at an intersection, and that's waiting at an intersection more than a minute from when you arrive to it. It also helps us to identify if we want to have roundabouts or other alternatives for transportation through our town. Roundabouts move traffic a lot more efficiently than signals, but people don't typically like to see roundabouts where they haven't seen them before. So there's some evaluation. So we have to make those kind of considerations. We have to talk to the public and find out what they want. I personally love roundabouts because they move traffic a lot more efficiently than signals do. You don't have to stop, you just have to slow down, and it continually moves through. The reason I really like them, though, is that you don't have the infrastructure. You don't have the electricity for the lights. You don't have lights that go out. They operate in the rain. They operate in the storms. They operate with no power. We don't have to continually go out and pull maintenance on them. So once they're in place, and they operate fine. So, but I'll get off my soapbox on roundabouts, and we'll move back to what do we consider? We consider the existing conditions, the traffic counts, the speeding, speeding. I'm sorry, that was a Freudian slip. We do a speed survey to find out how fast people are going through town. The pavement condition, existing connections and alternate routes. We need to figure out secondary routes, secondary ways people can get to places, because if the main roads get clogged up, if there's congestion on the main lines, then people start using the surface streets. We see that when the freeway gets clogged up, and we see people coming over onto Taylor and taking shortcuts through Horseshoe Bar. We see that when Horseshoe Bar or Taylor get congested, people start taking the side streets and going around on Magnolia or Oak. We also have to look at the future conditions and what we're going to pick in our land designations, where we're going to put commercial, industrial, businesses, and residential, the higher density residential and the lower density residential. We need to know where those cars are going to be coming from. We also have to look at other modes of transportation, bikes, pedestrians, buses, trains. We have to think about all of those things. You know, we don't have any train stops here in Loomis, but we do have to consider trains. We have to consider how they affect our movement of traffic through Loomis. We also have to think about commuters taking trains and getting down to the train stations. We also try to predict the future, you know, and that's kind of the fun part of this whole thing, where we start seeing self-driving cars and how that's going to influence our traffic. You know, it means that when we pick our standards, we need to make sure that we're picking uniform standards that other people have done too, because these autonomous vehicles won't recognize if we come up with our own widths of roads or our own traffic markings or you know, an odd shaped traffic circle or something. So we need to make sure that we're accounting for that. We also have to figure out, you know, how is online shopping and having people have deliveries straight to their homes, you know, how does that affect traffic? Is that increasing traffic, or is it pulling trucks off of the road and replacing them with cars that can move around more quickly and more nimbly? We also have to look at mass transit and ride sharing. We have to evaluate all of those and see how they play a part in the town. And then most importantly is the new regulations and the guidelines. These are the rules that we really have to play by. That's kind of the starting point, if you will. And I've got some more details on that. These are some guidelines. These are some suggestions that the state has come up with from the Office of Planning and Research. They provide recommendations on the types of policies in the circulation element. They also allow local government to make the decisions that we can refine our circulation element to fit us. So we can define it to fit us, and it's not going to be a statewide circulation element. It's going to be a town-specific circulation element. And so they still, at this time, they still give us the freedom to do that. We also have to collaborate and coordinate with our neighbors. We have to talk about what's going on in Rockland. Rockland is their own city. They get to make their own rules. They get to decide where to put things, where to do things in Rockland. But it definitely affects us. And how we choose to do things here in Loomis affects them. So we need to coordinate that and make sure that we're talking and making sure that we're making connections and not putting up roadblocks. We also have to look at a shift from LOS to VMT. And I'm going to give a very high level view of that. LOS is level of service, and that's basically a grade of intersections. Each intersection is given a grade, like I said, about how long you wait at that intersection. VMT stands for vehicle miles of travel, and we're about to find out, it's a mandate from the state that has us look at where people live and where they work and where they shop and where they recreate, and trying to reduce the number of miles that they travel to do that. So when we have to evaluate a project in CEQA, we have to evaluate, is it going to have people driving farther? Is it going to have people coming from farther distances to come here? Or is it going to stimulate people walking, getting out of their cars, using alternate modes of travel? And then we also have to consider trade-offs between mobility and other goals like greenhouse gases, safety, public health. I think in the past, circulation elements have been very focused on how do we get people to drive where they want to go, and how do we make sure that they can get there. Now we need to look at what's the balance of that. How much greenhouse gas are we putting in the atmosphere? Is there alternates to that? Can we provide mass transit there? Can we provide other forms of transportation like bikes or pedestrians? So the recent changes in guidelines, let's see, I apologize. We need to promote multimodal improvements. We need to lower VMT. And a lot of this has to do with California meeting its goals for greenhouse gases that the feds have given us. The feds have given us goals. California's come up with some ideas on how to meet those goals, and we have to kind of play by their rules on that. VMT also seems to increase transportation safety by reducing speed and increasing drivers' attention. Higher speeds increase likelihood of and severity of collisions. Narrower lanes and traffic calming measures are recommended. Reduction in VMT is linked to an increase in safety. We also have to have an increased focus on parking management, active transportation, and complete streets. Complete streets are like what we did in the downtown core area, where we have sidewalks, parking, landscaping, and other, everything from pedestrians and bikes. It's a little softening of that with the landscaping, narrowing the lanes through that area so that you keep cars separated from people walking or using other modes of transportation. So there's been some recent legislation that we have to adhere to. The Complete Streets Act, that's actually legislation now that we have to start providing more of those types of improvements that we did in the downtown core area. AB 32 and SB 32 established greenhouse gas reduction targets. We've got to do our part to meet those targets. We can't just claim that we're a small town and we don't have a lot of cars. We actually have to do our part to meet those. Like I said, we're having a shift from level of service to VMT. We're requiring creation of sustainable communities. That has to do with people being able to walk to the store to get their groceries. And you have to think of all the other things too, of watering the landscaping and all those other things. Let's see. And then promotes regional planning. And like I said, talking to our neighbors about connecting our bike trails, not just our roads, but our bike trails and our pedestrian facilities. SB 1000 requires circulation elements to address environmental justice issues. And to be honest, I don't even know what that means. But I did bring a transportation engineer, a traffic engineer. He can probably expand on that if need be. But we do need to make sure that we're providing equality and equal opportunity for everybody, regardless of their socioeconomical situation. So how do we use a circulation element? Like I said, it's our plan for our future. We use it to inform our impact fee program, where we have identified the new roads that we need to build so that we can require developers to provide their part. We need to do, we can use our circulation element to show our roadway sections and what we want our roads to look like. It leads to things like our downtown master plan or these other large master plan efforts of the bike pedestrian plans. We can also identify our deficiencies. Like we seem to only have, Taylor is the only road that goes north-south through Loomis. It's the only way for people to get north-south. It's when the freeway gets congested and people get on that road, it gets very congested and we have long delays and there's no parallel facilities to pull people off of that. So when the freeway gets congested, Taylor gets congested, people start running through our residential roads and they're going, because they're just passing through, they're trying to get through it as quickly as they can. So we need to think about that. We need to find and provide alternate paths for people to get around. And it also helps us coordinate with our neighbors and help us understand what our neighbors are doing so that we can understand what their impacts are going to be to us. So with that being said, I thought that I'd like to just highlight again how we build roads in Loomis. And this is basically in any jurisdiction. You can do it one of two ways. You can either have developers build the roads or you can have the town build the roads. If the developer builds the roads, they build it at their cost. They're going first. We put the demand on them to do it. It's part of their project. They need to dedicate the right-of-way. They need to build the road or a certain portion of the road. In any case, they always have to build the frontage, the curb, gutter, sidewalk, and that lane that borders their property. But we cannot make them fix existing conditions. The existing conditions, what it is now, is a baseline, and we are responsible for that. The town at large is responsible for that. We can't make somebody come in and fix our problems. Developers are only responsible for their incremental increase. If a developer asks for special concessions, if they want to do something different that doesn't quite meet our standards, then we can go through we can negotiate a development agreement, and then we can ask them to do more stuff. We can actually put it on them to do more stuff, but that's a negotiated deal. That's not a given. That's not it's not an easy thing to do either. And like I said, we can require them to dedicate the land if it's shown in our general plan and in our circulation element, and they're planning to develop their property. If they're not planning to develop their property and the town needs the facility first, then the town has to build the facility. And that means that that we have to buy the right-of-way from that landowner. That means that we have to build the improvement at our cost. We have to pay prevailing wage. We don't get to negotiate costs. We have to provide prevailing wage. We have to do some additional studies that developers don't typically have to do. So the projects end up costing quite a bit more. And if you're buying the right-of-way, it's typically twice as much as what a developer would end up having to pay for that same improvement. So we're responsible for the existing problems. We're responsible for traffic outside the area. We can't put that on developers either. As Lincoln expands and builds more, and we have people driving from the freeway to Lincoln, Sierra College Boulevard is a regional facility, but it goes through Loomis, and Loomis is responsible for it. We have to come up with the money to keep Sierra College Boulevard open through Loomis. We have to fill the potholes, we have to overlay it, and most of the traffic on Sierra College is pass-through traffic, getting to Placer County, getting to Lincoln, getting down to the freeway. So we need to make sure that we've identified that, and we've got money and ways to fix it. We can't put up a toll. I haven't talked to our legal counsel yet, but I've had several suggestions from people. Maybe put some speed bumps on there to slow people down. Can't do that. We can't put a toll. Public roads belong to the public. They belong to everybody. Just like you have the right to drive through Roseville on any public road, people from Roseville, Lincoln, and Auburn have every right in the world to drive on all of our roads. So we can't tell them no, we can't charge them to do so, and we can't put in things to discourage them, like speed bumps. Let's see. And we can, one of the things that we can get some funding is in our impact fee program. Otherwise, the money's got to come from the general fund or gas tax or our other road dollars. I just threw this slide in there. I know that I've talked about cross sections. These are our cross sections of roads. This is out of our current general plan, and this is one of the fun things that we get to do during the circulation element part of the project is figuring out what we want our roads to look like, where we want our kind of our downtown core area to look like, what we want our rural roads to look like. We get to pick those and define those sections and where those go in town. And that becomes our ultimate goal of what we're going to try to build. So with that, I'd like to kind of close things up by talking about how people can get involved. Like I said, we're going to start this circulation element update. It's going to take quite a bit of time to do. We've got to do a lot of research and we got to do some traffic counts. We've got to do some speed surveys. We've got to start laying the foundation. But if people are interested, they can definitely go to the Loomis General Plan Update site, give us an email. We'll be having some outreach meetings. We will be taking commentary, taking questions, and we will be trying to address people's concerns throughout this process. So with that being said, is there any questions?
If there's money raised and you have funds aside, you say, oh, this is what we want to do. Like, let's say we want to make Horseshoe Bar Road into a complete streets. And then, for example, and then you got the problem with Sierra College Boulevard and the traffic. Can an outside agency, county or state, come in and say, well, and make that a priority? Since you said we own Sierra College Boulevard and we're responsible for maintenance, do we have the right for decision making on where the funds go versus somebody from outside can say, let's say, well, we want Sierra College Boulevard to be a low priority because those are paths and we don't care. We care about Horseshoe Bar. Do you know that? Is that?
I didn't quite understand. If you're talking about,
well, we have a priority. Can somebody come in and redirect our priorities?
No, but it's prudent that we evaluate that. We're legally responsible for what goes on Sierra College Boulevard.
What about the Placer County Transportation Commission and their funds?
PCTPA worked with Lincoln, Roseville, Rockland, Placer County to form Sparta.
Okay.
Sierra College Boulevard is in Sparta.
Okay.
Except for the section in Loomis.
And why is that?
Because at the time,
backed out.
Because Loomis backed out.
Okay, so we get no money from the surrounding communities to help us with Sierra College Boulevard because we tried to put up a stop sign. Is that a correct summary?
That's
kind of blunt, I guess.
It's a blunt summation, yes.
Okay, well,
yes.
I'm a third generation civil engineer, going back to my grandfather. So we're talking about a subject that's near and dear to me and very important to me. And I see that a resistance in Loomis to provide for transportation. And as a consequence, it's taking me longer to get to my house where I can enjoy the oak trees. And so I see that as counterproductive for the goals of Loomis. I think that we need to move the traffic through and get them out of my town, not try to inhibit the flow so that we have to deal with it. So, you mentioned our impact fee program,
Correct.
and we have a we currently have a circulation element.
Correct.
Showing some roundabouts,
Correct.
some signals, and some new roads, previously identified by other projects as $14 million worth of work. I suspect it's less than that. It's in the $10 to $12 million range. And the town identified those improvements. The circulation element.
Yes.
Okay. How much money have we collected in fees to construct these roads, these roundabouts?
I have not, I apologize, I didn't bring the number of what's in the bank there? 300,000.
We have 300,000 to construct improvements that
Just wait.
I can shout.
You were going to anyway.
So we have $300,000 in the bank, a plus or minus.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on these figures, but they're in the right ballpark. To construct over $10 million worth of improvements that we have identified.
Correct. Correct.
Okay, I see a big quagmire coming, real big one.
Yeah.
Now, I also want to point out that some years ago, and I can't tell you, it might have been 20 years ago, we had a 900-acre fire here in Loomis. Covered from the railroad tracks both ways. I have relatives in Santa Rosa, and I have a long-term friend who lives in Santa Rosa. Santa Rosa has a lot of roads. They barely got out. They almost burned. But the police came through saying, "Get out now." One of my lifelong friends threw his kids in the car and barely got out. We have no alternative routes here. If the fire were to strike downtown, the fire trucks need the road to fight the fire. The other roads could be blocked by fire, and we have no alternative routes. This is what happened in Paradise.
Right.
The people of Paradise and the planners in Paradise did not want big roads running through Paradise. And I'm speaking, when I say Paradise, I'm talking about a beautiful community. They wanted it rural. People died because of that decision. And I want public safety, I think, should be a major consideration of our circulation plan. And I think that needs to be brought to the forefront, because all people seem to be worried about is more cars on the road. The cars are coming anyway.
Correct.
We have to provide for them. We've got $300,000 we've provided so far. We're in trouble.
Right.
So I would say we need to identify a plan and some funding so that our community is safe.
I think there's a couple of points that I'd like to expand on a little bit. The $300,000 that you're referring to is the dedicated portion that was collected in our traffic impact fee program.
Correct.
I believe that those projects were only estimated at a couple of $1 million.
Okay.
So there were, in that particular DA that I think you're referring to, there were a tremendous amount of improvements that were worked out, negotiated, that the developer was going to provide, that are not identified in our current circulation element, or, well, they're identified in it, but they're not in our impact fee program.
Okay.
And I'm updating our traffic impact fee program right now.
Okay.
And I should be bringing that to the council in January or February. We're working out the final details on updating those fees so we can collect a little bit more money. But like I was saying, you can only charge developers for what their portion of it is. You can't charge developers for the existing. You can't charge developers for the outside influences. So
But it's the town's responsibility.
It is the town's
to provide for the
responsibility.
safety of our citizens,
Yeah.
and we're not doing it.
right, and we definitely need to provide additional parallel facilities so that when Taylor gets clogged, when Horseshoe Bar gets clogged, when Barton, Brace, the intersections over at Laird and Horseshoe Bar, when those get impacted, when there's an accident there or there's an emergency that we need to move people around, we have places we can go. We definitely need those things, and
We need to identify a funding source for those.
right, and we
It needs
need,
to be part of our circulation plan is how are we gonna do it?
yeah,
And I just feel that instead of basing our decisions on engineering criteria of the traffic and where it's gonna be, we're using emotional decisions of, I hate traffic, I don't want cars. But these are not Loomis cars. So you've given me some counts here. And it looks like we're moving about 1,700 cars per hour at the peak hour through Horseshoe Bar and Taylor Road. So from that, you can make some projections about what's the total traffic coming through this intersection in a day.
correct.
Okay, so we have 6,800 residents, average 3 people per household. It might be 3.2. I'm in the ballpark here. So we have about 2,200 residents, and I'm not sure about this number because transportation is not my expertise, but I think that 2,200 houses going to generate about 15,000 trips a day. I'm going 7 trips per day out of the house. Do you have anyone here can help me with this?
Yeah, per house. How many?
Per household, how many houses per dwelling unit?
That's high. I think that's high.
Let's
So-
see, 2,200 times 7 is 14,000, 15,000 about.
That might be a little conservative. It may be as high as 10 trips per house.
Okay. My point is, unless every man, woman, and child is driving Horseshoe Bar at Taylor Road, every man, woman, and child in Loomis passing through there several times a day, these are not our cars.
Right,
We got to get them out of here. The only way to do that is to provide traffic lanes for them so that I can go home.
right.
And I'm very concerned that emotional decisions are made regarding the long-term planning of Loomis, and we're not providing for the safety of our citizens. I don't want to see another Paradise. I don't want to see another Santa Rosa here in Loomis. So I would like to see us in our circulation plan figure out how we're going to pay for it. Not come up with a nice plan. We have a good plan. I like it. Doc Barnes Drive, the roundabouts, Webb Street. I think it's a decent plan. How are we going to get it? We just rejected really our only option to obtain these improvements for our town. So we need to identify some other way to do it. Because piecemeal development, as you know,
Yeah.
does not work. And as you said, a developer is only responsible for developing in front of his development. So in other words, you don't get a Doc Barnes Drive that goes all the way through from one end to the other, preceding the creation of the traffic. First, the traffic is created. Eventually, hopefully, it can take 20 years, it can take 50 years, you do get it built. But in the meantime, you haven't provided for the safety of our citizens. So that's my whole point of this dissertation, is that our transportation element provides for the safety of our town and for the smooth movement of traffic so that I'm not stuck in the city. So that's I'm putting that burden on you, Britt. Let's get some ideas going.
If I can Can I
I'm
add?
done. Thank you.
Okay.
I've spoken far longer than I should.
I just want to bring up a point that might maybe of clarification, is that the circulation element that we're working on is just that, and the funding is not a part of that element. So I think you've got, and Mike's point is maybe we need to identify funding and then you do the element, but I don't think you can do it that way.
No,
I think you do the circulation element and then the council could figure out ways to get the funding. Is that correct?
It is to the large extent, but we will be sensitive to funding as we work the circulation element. I mean, first thing is safety. Being able to get, fire trucks to our houses if they're on fire, or ambulances from your house to the hospital. We need to make sure that those things are,
Right.
Those elements are looked at. Funding is not outside the discussion. It is definitely something that we should be considering looking at, but the circulation element is basically the map, the road map, literally the road map of where we want to put the roads
Right.
here in Loomis. And depending on what those roads are and how they look, funding it'll become obvious what the funding is,
What needs to be done?
what needs to happen.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks for bearing with me.
No, you're good. A couple of items that occurred to me as you were going through, and I wondered how they're being considered. One is, in looking at the demographics, I presume you're looking not just at now, but this is a projection for
Correct.
20 years. And we know that population is aging, and a lot of people that have grown up and grown older in Loomis want to stay here. So I was wondering, in what ways do you look at aging population? Is that a consideration?
Absolutely it
What
is.
kinds of transportation needs there are going to be?
Well, we're working with the county. Just an example of that is we're working with the county and our mass transit, the bus system, because many seniors do use the buses and they still get out and about. We participate with Dial-A-Ride. We participate with these other programs that help people get rides. But definitely, that is something that will be looked at in the circulation element.
And maybe NEVs, if they're not going to drive a regular car on the freeway or something, they may like NEVs to be going around town, or even the three-wheel bikes, or that kind of thing, which is wider than a regular bicycle, as well as walking. Anyway, that was one of my things I wondered about. The other is, I understand the advantages of roundabouts. One of my concerns is I've used, like the roundabouts in Rockland and other places, is pedestrian safety, because I understand how things work at an intersection or in crosswalks, and I know that the one in Rockland, I've looked at, how do people get around here, and there's a crosswalk slightly beyond the roundabout, but I wonder about, are the drivers going through the roundabout really used to looking for pedestrians to cross? We're used to looking for pedestrians to cross at intersections. So pedestrian safety at roundabouts is one of my concerns.
They're not pedestrian friendly roundabouts.
And if we have older people,
They
they
were
need a
not.
little more time to get across cross intersections anyway.
I think the design for roundabouts is starting to evolve, and pedestrian, where the pedestrian crossings have been looked at, and I think they're becoming a lot more safe and a lot more friendly to pedestrians. Bringing the pedestrians back from that intersection keeps them visible and is a lot safer for them. So it may be a little farther of a walk for them, but it is safe for them. And they'll continue to work on that, and we'll definitely look at that. I think it is our goal here in Loomis to have a transportation system through Loomis that takes into consideration cars, bikes, pedestrians. We want to make this community as walkable as possible, as bike-friendly as possible. We have a lot of cyclists who use our community on the weekends and after work. They're using our local roads, and they're sharing the roads with cars. I'd like to try to see what we can do to make that as safe as possible for the cyclist and for the cars. So.
Yeah, don't some roundabouts, I think I've seen them, were actually in the pedestrian crosswalk, they will have a signal. They can push a button and it'll stop flow traffic.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things that they've looked at and they're trying. I think putting a signal almost defeats the purpose of a roundabout. So, but it is a PED signal and it's only on demand.
Yeah.
So,
Right, on demand, yeah.
yeah, we'll definitely look to see what is appropriate for Loomis.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Under level of service, you know, how long we wait at stoplights, is that looked at with our trains that come back and forth? Are the trains that come through our town, do they come at the same time every day or not? I mean, can we depend on that? At 2 o'clock, that train's going to come by and I'm going to sit here for 2 minutes or 10
Yeah.
minutes, however.
They're completely random.
Okay, so they're random. So there's no way of detecting.
Some of the things that there's no way to detect where they're coming from. Well, you can, and we could even do a quiet zone through Loomis, but that is, I think it's upwards of $250,000 an intersection. So it's incredibly expensive and very time-consuming to do. Some of the other things that we can do, though, is the preemption and coordinating our signals. One of the projects that we have identified in, if that tax measure goes through, that we would be spending some of that money, that revenue that we would be receiving, would be to do the signal maintenance, to redo our signals, because right now they're actually too old to interconnect and to have them operating as a kind of a combined system.
So you can still keep it moving while it's going this way.
Exactly. It would definitely look at where those conflicts are and making sure that the movements that can occur while the train is going do occur instead of everybody stopping until the train goes through.
So I think that's a really big problem in our town. I mean,
it is.
Okay, which direction's coming? I'll keep going down here and then go that way because I'll get through faster. You know, you're trying to figure it all out, but I wondered in the surveys that they're going to take, the level of service, you know, they're going to take into account that we have trains that come just sporadically.
I think at some point, too, Sierra College Boulevard's going to need to be a grade-separated crossing of the railroad tracks, because it definitely affects that.
That's $30 million or more.
Yeah, that's probably light.
Mary Beth, you had a question earlier?
Yeah, Jean kind of touched on it, and that was NEV lanes and their compatibility with walking and biking. Or do now our roads have to increase even more to accommodate an electric vehicle to keep that separation between cars and EVs?
I think that would have to be a much larger discussion, because there's different degrees of electric vehicles being legalized, or legal routes for those. You know, are we going to build additional roads, like a bike trail that kind of has some shortcuts, but you can only use an electric vehicle on there, or bikes? That's right-of-way, and that's, how are we going to pay for that, and where do we map those routes out?
Can they share the road?
They can share the road when the speed limit is at a certain speed.
You know what
I think it's 25 miles an hour. I think it can't be above 25 miles an hour.
Didn't we do a survey on that? We paid like $25,000 to find out that we couldn't do it because our roads are too narrow. And
It's not feasible.
It wasn't feasible.
We
And
did.
there's not a lot of us that have golf carts, you know, to drive around. So you know, I'm just saying.
Right. I didn't, that study occurred before I got here.
Oh, okay.
I do know that study kind of shelved the idea for NEVs.
Yes, we did. I remember.
I just worry about paving the planet, too.
Right.
We've got to create a special lane for the NEV, special lane for bikes, widen the roads.
Very,
You know.
very expensive.
Asphalt's asphalt, you know. And it's not grass, it's not green.
Right. And as part of, well, I'm not,
Now, Rockland did have NEV around the golf course when it was still there, and posted 25-mile-an-hour speed limits, and they just used the regular driving routes because the speed limit was low enough, and the police did enforce that. I know
Rockland's
people that
good
got
that way,
tickets for going 35 in there. But they were using the regular driving lanes, not separated lanes.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, especially if we get, let's say, something in the village area where probably the speed limits, for the most part, are not going to be too high. Somebody told me there was 35, but given that Rockland was 25, where they've taken theirs down now. They're without the the golf course. There's not the same incentive, or like there is in Lincoln for Lincoln Hills.
Because, I mean, I look at how many people are you moving. NEDs are not going to do it for us. They're good for the environment. I like them. But in reality, you're going to move far fewer people per hour by reducing speed limit and putting some NEDs on the road.
But even if you're not putting them out on the general road,
At least in the subdivisions or something.
within the subdivision, especially if that area were to develop with housing and jobs, people can bike or walk to jobs, but if it's older people that aren't feeling stable enough to bike or something like that, or just want to be able to get around or visit their friends and things, then they're not necessarily doing it at commute times with everybody else if they're not going to a job. So they're not necessarily impacting the worst kind of. They're probably not.
Track the peak hour.
They're probably not taking kids to high school and things like that.
Old people sleep late, right?
Anyway.
Is there any more comments from staff? Anybody have anything? Okay. Anybody else? I was going to move it to public comment. All right. Okay, thanks, Britt.
Thanks.
Okay, are we going to open up to public comment? Any?
Stay up here, Brett. I got a few questions. Roger Smith. Oh, man. Just when I was getting going.
That's it, Roger.
You said the magic word.
Okay. Mainly questions. I have a big question about the status of the process right now. Just starting, I guess. Is that right, Brett? Right? And we just heard tonight about the circulation element. But it's a huge undertaking to update a general plan. We just heard about one element of it tonight from Britt, and to me that's overwhelming. I'm a former engineer too, and if that was laid on my shoulders, man, how do I do this? The point I'm making is the town using any consultants to help out the town in this immense project?
Yes.
That's a question.
Yes.
We are?
Okay. Got one here.
Okay. All right. And any, I live part-time in another town in the summers, and I'm involved a little bit there with the same thing, update of a general plan. It's a different state, but they hired it's a town about 5 or 6 times bigger than Loomis. Not a huge city, but they hired a consultant to handle the public input element of it, and they hired a consultant to manage the overall general plan effort. All right. Okay. So that's great. So I'm envisioning trying to take some load off of this poor guy here, because there's tremendous effort that's required. Will there be an EIR required for the general plan update? That's a question. There is an EIR required.
Choking over there.
Okay. And will there be a formal traffic study by a traffic engineering firm?
Yes.
That looks at existing traffic and projected traffic?
Yes.
Okay, good. The process for public input, I'm quite concerned about that. I hope that will be some structure to that will be with a lot of advance notice and things. And back to the circulation element, though, the impact fees to me are huge. And if we don't get something, as I understand, if we don't get something in the circulation plan in the way of projects identified by the town as must-do things to have a future traffic-wise, if we don't get them in the general plan, are they not eligible for any impact fees? Or so, in other words, is it really important, isn't it, to get them in the general plan, to get them in the circulation element, so that in the future they can be part of the capital improvement program, and that impact fees can be levied and assigned to those.
You can make them build it. If
Or make them build it, but
circulation plan.
with luck, yeah.
If we approve the development, but if you don't, they don't do it.
Okay. With the, so I guess I'm correct on that, in assuming that we better get important projects that we have any foreseeable possibility of into the general plan.
We could extend a few
That'd be
minutes.
great.
I don't see,
I just had one more question.
we got a light crowd tonight, so.
Okay. So yeah, very important to get big projects in, and of course I've been beating the drum on the King Road access as the savior project for Loomis, and I did send a letter out this past week to everybody here, I think, that really beat that drum again, and the point I wanted to make is that I think, I'm a former Caltrans guy and have worked for and with Caltrans even to this date, but I've worked on some committees with them. I know how they work, but I think with persistence, we can get Caltrans to make exceptions to some of their rules that they voiced about access to I-80. I think that's a reality of Caltrans. If you look around here, there are many instances. I drove on one today, an off-ramp from I-80 onto Elm Street in Auburn, coming westbound.
Yeah.
That sucker changes radius and becomes so steep halfway through it. It does not meet does not meet interstate standards, does not meet Caltrans standards. They bent the rules. They can bend the rules, even though initially they're saying the interchanges would be too close, possibly, barely. But there's exceptions that can be made there. So I do want to see persistence on the part of the town, maybe in the form of a town committee going to meet with District 3 Caltrans in Marysville and really looking at plans, making measurements, pressing them on this opportunity. And then the other question was, I heard about the roundabouts tonight. Is the village street plan that was proposed as part of the village transportation plan, is that still sort of sacred, or did that go away with the village plan, or is there still, well, we're going to still want a roundabout here and we want this here? And so that's a question, I guess, Britt. So that's my concerns right now. Thank you.
Very good. So
Thank you, Roger.
I'll try to address a couple of those things. This is actually right out of our circulation element, our current circulation element. And the village was going to build this roundabout that is identified in the circulation element.
Up front, correct?
Up front.
Okay.
And they were also going to build dock barns. This was kind of a late hit to the village project. We had updated our circulation element while they were in review. So we had to go through the development agreement, and we got them to update their whole site plan to build this extension of Webb Street down to Horseshoe Bar and build the traffic circle or the roundabout at Horseshoe Bar and Webb Street, Library, Horseshoe Bar. It's an odd-shaped intersection. I won't get into it. It's an odd-shaped intersection, and the signal actually won't work in that location. So that's in the current circulation element, and I would look to leave that in. I think that is a discussion that we're probably going to have with the residents and the kind of the town at large to talk about if we want traffic circles here in Loomis, and if we want them, then we've definitely got them identified where they're going to work and work well. I didn't bring a larger map, I apologize, of the town. I could go over some more of the features that are in the circulation element currently, and we'll probably be expanding on. Some of the funding that, that we were talking about. For funding of the roads is very important, and And I appreciate what Roger was saying, that we should try to put as much of this on the developers as we can, and we certainly should. But there is a legal limit on what we can put on the developer, and basically that legal limit is somewhere around what their impacts are. So they're only providing for their incremental hit to the system, so to speak. And that is calculated out when we're doing our impact fee program. We look at how much land is developable, and we assign a certain portion of the upcoming traffic to that, and then that tells us how much we can charge. So we charge them a traffic impact fee for building the new roads or updating our roads that we can, but it is a very small portion of it. I would ballpark it in the neighborhood of about 10%. So we need to talk about how we're going to get other forms to fund these roads. And the other mechanisms to fund these roads are not the gas tax that we currently pay to the feds. That comes back to us in some road maintenance dollars. We get about $300,000 a year. We need $750,000 a year just to maintain the current condition of pavement that we have. We also get some SB1 dollars, which is the new gas tax and registration tax that the state enacted, and that's going to give us about $150,000 a year to pay for filling potholes, overlays, some surface treatments and stuff like that. Any projects that we want to expand the capacity of our roads, if we want to build new roads, if we want to increase the capacity, that has to come from either our general fund or something like this Measure M tax measure that the county is trying to implement.
Or perhaps a development agreement?
Or development agreements, but I don't know if...
But that's all part of negotiation.
That's all part
You
of
can
negotiation.
negotiate for them to pay for the whole thing.
If a project comes in by right, we don't get a chance at a development agreement with them.
Right.
We have to
They
change it
share-
to a PD, right? We have to
So
apply.
they have to ask to go to a PD. They
Yeah.
have to ask
And we have
for
to pass it.
they have to ask for something from us, and we have to give them some kind of concessions. It's a development agreement is a contract, is a negotiation. But if a project comes in by right, we don't have the ability to go after a DA with them. Getting back to the tax, this Measure M is what the tax measure was before. It's a sales tax measure to pay for capacity increasing projects. Those are some road projects on the freeway. You know, I want people to understand that when we increase the capacity when we fix the problems on the freeway of the off-ramps, the Rockland Road off-ramp or the interchange at 65 and 80, that reduces congestion on the freeway. That reduces the people who are using our roads to bypass that congestion. So those projects, those regional projects benefit Loomis. So we need to understand that. We also need to understand that at some point, Sierra College Boulevard is going to need to be 4 lanes through Loomis. I haven't even ballparked that project. Well, it was originally gone to 6.
Yeah,
I think
20,000 cars a day.
a lot of jurisdictions have. Sparta has actually downsized it through certain sections.
Okay.
You'll notice going from Rockland Road to going up over the hill to the mega churches.
Yes.
They actually reduced that down to 4 lanes, and they're going to stick with 4 lanes. That was originally a 6-lane
Yeah.
facility. They've decided that they can go to 4 and leave it at that. And that would be whether it goes from 4 lanes or it goes to 6 lanes, Loomis has got to come up with the money to do it through our section through town.
Wow.
We've got to find a funding source for that. And
Can we get in the Placer County Sparta?
we cannot,
Can we buy in?
we have made offers. We have requested. We have gone hat in hand to Sparta
Yes.
and asked nicely. And
They don't like us.
no, it's not that they don't like us. It's that when we did not participate in Sparta, we did it in such a way that
Made us not like them.
We thumbed our nose at them. We thumbed our nose at them.
they incurred a lot of cost. We would have to pay that cost back. And it is substantial. And it is documented. And it is never going to go away. So the opportunity to get back into Sparta is not really, I mean, Sean and I have tried very, very hard to do. We won't give up, and we will certainly look for opportunities to do that. But we need to realistically, we need to figure out how we're going to pay for it. Like I was saying, that sales tax measure would fund capacity increasing projects. They would help us fund Horseshoe Bar Road interchange, which is a severely underfunded project right now. It is in our project, it is in our CIP. We have not identified where the funding is going to come from for that.
But the town of Loomis would have to pass that measure, as a local.
So we,
Placer County is going to form a district, and everybody in that district will collect the sales tax from the businesses located in that district. And then they will portion back out the money to the districts according to a formula of population and lane miles, which is a formula that they use to give us back gas tax money or give us a portion of CMAQ money. And frankly, Loomis does pretty good on that formula, because while we don't have a lot of people, we don't have a lot of population, we do have a lot of road miles, and so proportionate to our population. So we do fairly well on that formula. So it is it's good. And plus, we spend our money in Rockland, Lincoln, Roseville, and in Placer County. We don't have a lot of sales tax generating businesses in Loomis. Rayleigh's sells food. They don't sell a lot of taxed things. So when we go spend money in Rockland and in Roseville, if we're not in that district, we're going to pay to fix the roads in Rockland and in Roseville and in Lincoln, and we won't get our portion back for that. So it's important that we understand that, I think. Oh, and then one more thing is that Roger was expressing concern about how big this process is, and it is a big process. It's a daunting process. We're just barely starting it. I'm giving a presentation of what the circulation element is in the general plan. The general plan update is a huge project. I don't know how you're handling it, Anders. I admire your resolve, but. Ours is just one component of it. It is very large. Like I said, I think it's the most important piece of the puzzle, but I'm a little bit biased. We're starting the initial studies that are going to feed into the program. We're doing a pavement index study right now. We'll be doing a speed survey soon. And then when we actually contract, we'll probably be using Wood Rogers for this. They've worked very well for us in as our traffic engineer. So as we're going to do the research, do some groundwork right now, and then we'll officially kick that off. And when we do kick off the update for the circulation element, we will certainly be doing some more outreach. We're doing a presentation to the Planning Commission again, more specific on what we're doing, and then soliciting comments from the public and from all interested parties.
Okay, thank you, Brett. Is there any other public comment? Yes.
I think most of my,
Jenny Nisley, 4135 Hunters Drive. I think most of my questions have been answered between what you asked and what you said. But I just want to, I'm lost. I don't have my pen and paper to write these notes down. So I am looking at the schedule that's posted on the website of the timeline. And I understand it, the next step after you do all the reviews and take input, that there's the community input. And so will there be a workshop on each different element? And will the public then say, will there be a workshop where they'll say, I think you need to work on Horseshoe Bar exit, or I think is that going to be something that the public gets to say, or is that just kind of something that you guys will come back and tell us? You understand what I'm saying? Is like, are we going to have a workshop here where we're in a board and we say, I think this is really dangerous, and this is really, because I heard you say public safety, and Horseshoe Bar Road exit is a public safety issue, when it gets backed up onto the freeway. So is the community going to have an opportunity in the next step to talk about this?
Certainly, if you have any concerns, you can, the emails or any of these ways to contact the town. We've got the information website set up. We've got a dedicated email address for any general plan questions
I just
or
mean,
comments.
do we get that deep into the weeds of that? Do we get to talk about certain types of projects, or is it just kind of, here's your circulation, and it's...
No, I think the workshop will be
No, I think a workshop.
an open exchange, and you can bring whatever opinion and thought you have, yeah.
Okay. And then after that, you are going to, each one will do a technical study, which is number 3 on the list, and then that will all come back, and then we'll have another workshop or another opportunity to do that. I'm just making sure. And the other thing that I heard you speak many times is to think about how we're going to pay for these things. I've heard you say that you can go out for grants for certain things, but if we don't have the money to put in the same amount or something in it, then you typically don't get the grants you're kind of put down on the list. And so that's just something to think about with the sales tax measure and all of that. If we have a little more funds to put in, we might be able to combine it with a grant to get more done.
Exactly.
The way I understand it.
Yeah. So grants are competitive. We have to go out and try to compete with other jurisdictions for that money. One of the criteria that they grade us on when we're going out competing for a grant is how much skin in the game do we have? How much of our local resources are we going to go? A lot of projects, it used to be at the minimum of 11.43% was all you needed to come up with. But now other jurisdictions are seeing if we put in, 20%, 25%, 50%, then when the state or the feds are evaluating who's going to get that grant, they see that community is very invested in it. That's a much higher probability of success. So those projects usually went out now. That Measure M, that sales tax measure would help us get some money for that. It also labels us as a self-help community, which allows us to, which is another checkbox when they're grading grant applications.
Okay.
So some more tax revenue would really help our goals.
Well, I don't see how you can deliver anything without some kind of revenue source.
That's
if it's
correct.
going to be a sales tax revenue, it could be a property tax revenue.
Okay.
It could be, I don't know. I can guarantee you that the state and the feds are not going to come rescue us in this endeavor.
Okay, any other public comment? Anybody else? Okay, I think all right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
I'd like to move on to the next item, number 5, 20.
Could I just comment a bit on Roger's points, because they were very valuable. I want to remind you, I've been on the commission a long time. A long time ago, we had a proposal presented to us, and I believe you were on the commission with me, Greg. They talked about an auxiliary lane from King Road to Horseshoe Bar Road was the only way that Caltrans would grant a variance to their standards. So I think that's something we should get into our transportation element, is that at least the option of constructing an auxiliary lane running from King Road to Horseshoe Bar Road that provides for an interchange at King Road.
Is that Doc Barnes?
I don't know
Well,
what you,
Doc Barnes prevents the construction
No,
of the auxiliary
no,
lane.
Doc Barnes does not.
You don't think so?
No, Doc
Because
Barnes
it's
is,
planned up against the freeway.
it's far enough away.
Okay.
When this issue did come up earlier, and actually, Doc Barnes swings over to line up with Barton.
Right.
So there was nothing in that proposed project that got in the way of a slip ramp to get on the
Okay.
freeway.
Okay.
Like I said before, we haven't killed the project. We're not doing anything that would interfere with that project if it were to come along. If it does make sense at some point, if it does meet some requirements of the feds or the state where they would back us in that effort, then yeah, we're not doing anything to prevent that project from happening.
Because when I looked at the plan, that's what I thought. I thought Doc Barnes was going to block this potential auxiliary road.
Actually, I had the developer map that out for me, and they did a to-scale sketch on it.
Okay. Because my son is fourth generation civil engineer, supervising engineer for Caltrans, and he has told me that that's the only way you're going to get that interchange at King Road is with that auxiliary. Basically, auxiliary lane from Horseshoe Bar to the King Road intersection to accommodate interchanges that are too close together. So thank you, Roger. Good point.
Call it weaving lane.
okay.
Okay.
Right, so who's going to, town attorney?
Now for the less controversial part of the evening.
Right.
Okay, Brett, now we're on to the main event of the evening.
Or put it another way, the important part, the most important.
Now that you're all well rested after your meeting.
So, because you requested it and because I think it's important, given the number of changes to housing legislation this year, we're going to go through, well, in three parts here. The first part I'm going to go through is just kind of a rundown of all of the changes, all of the bills that affected housing legislation this year. Then we're going to take a deeper dive into a couple of the specific bills that have broader implications or implications that affect Loomis specifically. And then lastly, we're going to go over some examples and take questions. So diving right in, and the printout you may have might look a little bit different. I'm not sure if Mary Beth was able to print out
No, you have the current.
the current version? Okay, good. So diving in. I didn't do a count of how many housing bills there were this year, but I think it's safe to say it was well over 25. Some of them didn't end up taking effect because there were duplicate efforts taken by multiple legislators, so there was a little bit of confusion and some messes that will need to be cleaned up in the next year about that. But we'll start with AB 68. It streamlines the approvals for accessory dwelling units. There was a fair number of bills focused around ADUs this year and a lot of efforts to try and make the approval for ADUs a lot quicker. AB 116 made a change to EIFDs, which typically required voter approval. This requirement has now been taken away, and if you want to have an enhanced infrastructure financing district, now you no longer need the approval of voters to do so. AB 587 allowed for affordable housing organizations to, under certain circumstances, sell deed-restricted affordable units where there's some very detailed requirements for the homeowners that would be buying that unit from the organization. Previously, it was not possible for these organizations to sell affordable units. In AB 670, there was a limit on the restrictions that can be imposed on ADUs that are within common interest developments, and I'm told that there are a number of those in Loomis. So while initially there had been some hope for HOAs to maybe still kind of have separate restrictions from all of these limitations that are being put on local agencies for housing, No such luck. The legislators thought of that. Even common interest developments are subject to all of these limitations. This particular bill was for ADUs.
A
But
common interest development is what? Something with an HOA would,
yes, it's deed restricted communities. Those can come in various forms, but common interest development is kind of the state law term for that. Under AB 671, there is a requirement for the state to create a list of all of the possible grant and incentive programs for affordable ADU programs, and there's not a whole lot of detail in the bill for what this list would look like or timing requirements for HCD to develop this list, but eventually affordable housing developers and other homeowners who might want to add an affordable ADU on their property for whatever reason they might have will have a resource. And this also imposes the requirement that local housing plans and housing elements encourage affordable ADUs and affordable ADU rentals. And again, we don't have a whole lot of guidance about what that actually means in practice. So stay tuned for any community that's doing a housing element update to start exploring what exactly the legislature meant by that. Moving along, AB 881 is another bill that is just for streamlining ADU approvals. And it also did kind of an interesting thing where previously it was possible to require owner occupancy of ADUs. Starting on January 1st, that requirement will be removed for 5 years. And that any ADU that's approved in the next 5 years after January 1st that doesn't have this owner occupancy requirement will in perpetuity kind of retain that benefit, for lack of a better term. After 5 years, this provision sunsets, and unless there's some other legislative change, owner occupancy will again be able to be required for ADUs, except for those units that are built in the next 5 years where that restriction isn't applied. AB 1010 allows for Native American reservations to also apply for some affordable housing programs. Doesn't really affect Loomis too much. AB 1255 requires that surplus land and property be included for an online database of surplus lands that is being developed. Again, we don't have a whole lot of guidance yet because this database hasn't been developed. There's no specific deadline by which surplus land has to be reported. There's no kind of detail on how soon after surplus land is determined to be surplus it needs to be reported. So we'll probably get a little bit more guidance on this once the database is developed. AB 1483 requires that local jurisdictions maintain on their website information about zoning ordinances, development standards, fees, exactions, and any affordability requirements or affordability benefits provided in addition to the state density bonus law that any applicant who's looking to develop a property could reference easily. So this is basically just another requirement for what the town's website needs to include on it. And it also requires HCD to develop a 10-year housing data strategy, which, again, no detailed parameters on that. HCD has a lot of leeway on what exactly is meant by this. AB 1485 is supposed to promote moderate income units, which is a little bit different from a lot of the bills which were aimed at affordable units. So this is kind of the highest, or the most moderate of all of the affordable categories of units. And so this is also providing streamlined approvals for that, whereas some of the other bills were just aimed at the low income and very low income units. AB 1486 requires surplus land to be identified in housing elements. So this is just another piece where we're gathering and reporting information about surplus land. And also another duplicate effort to have a database of this property maintained by HCD. So there you can kind of see where the legislators were they all had great ideas and they all put them forth in their bills, and there was some coordination among the various bills to get this stuff consolidated, but there was a lot of duplicate efforts, and so now we're left sorting through all of that. And AB 1743, there is a property tax welfare exemption where certain properties are exempt from property taxes, and I guess previously it was okay for a local agency to reject housing projects on the basis of them qualifying for this exemption, because here the legislature specifically carved out that as a basis for denying a project. Under AB 1763, there is an additional density bonus that's afforded to 100% affordable projects. Now, in reviewing these bills and looking at some of the other synopses of all of the housing legislation, there seemed to be a little bit of confusion that this was replacing the state density bonus law. That isn't so. This is just another additional tier of benefit under the state density bonus law for 100% affordable projects. Under SB 6, there is supposed to be another inventory, this time of sites suitable for residential development. And residential development is defined in there as being 100% residential, or any site where 2/3 of the property may be used for residential purposes. So depending on what your various zoning classifications are, it may not just be straight residential zoning that needs to be identified in this inventory. SB 13 is another streamlining for ADU approvals. This bill was actually completely subsumed by one of the other bills, but nevertheless, it was approved, signed by the governor, with no practical effect at the end of the day. SB 196 is another tax piece of legislation that doesn't have any particular effect on Loomis. And then there's SB 330, which we'll be wrapping back around on in part 2 of the presentation. But in short, it establishes the Housing Crisis Act of 2019 and all that that entails. And it's aimed at creating a lot more housing in all parts of the state, or in a lot of parts of the state. And then getting into SB 330 a little bit more. As I already said, it's aimed at creating new housing, and it does so in a number of different ways by providing some benefits to affordable units and streamlining their and promoting the approval of any housing development projects, which is kind of an umbrella term that doesn't just apply to affordable units, but this bill also encourages the development of housing generally. And so in the legislation, housing development projects are defined as residential use only, mixed use developments where at least 2/3 of the square footage will be residential, and also transitional and supportive housing. So any project that falls under any of those categories would be subject to SB 330. And those projects also still have to comply with all of the regular development standards that are in place. So this bill doesn't replace any of those standards, except for where it does. So the first thing that SB 330 kind of attempts to do is the streamlining of the application process. And in doing that, it limits what information can be required on the preliminary application for housing development projects. And I think I'll actually go through and read what those requirements can be, because what the town can require from applicants is limited to this list. On preliminary applications, after this bill, the town is limited to the following list of information: the specific location, the existing uses, a site plan for the project, the proposed land uses and the number of units along with the square footage of those units, proposed number of parking spaces, proposed point sources of air and water pollution, any species of special concern that are known to occur on the property where the project is proposed, if the project is proposed in a very high fire hazard severity zone, if there are any wetlands on the property, if it's a hazardous waste site, if it's a special flood hazard area, if it's along an earthquake fault zone, if there are any stream or other resources that might require a stream bed alteration permit, and the location for those, if there are such sites, any historic or cultural resources that might be on the property, the number of proposed below market rate units, the number of bonus units that the developer of the project is seeking to utilize under the density bonus law, and whether any approvals under the MAP Act are required, contact information for the developer, the location of any easements on the property, the number of residential units that might already be on the site, and the number of residential units that would be removed based on the proposed development. So if you're tearing down residential to build a new property, or to build a different type of property. And then, in addition to having this limited list of requirements, the town going forward is going to be required to maintain a list of all of these requirements for developers, for project applicants to reference, and that should also be maintained on the town's website. And then, in addition to having that checklist, the town can also develop its own application form to follow this kind of streamlined approval process, or use the form that HCD is going to develop in the near term, but we don't have that template yet.
Do they have an idea of when that will be available?
They don't. They don't even have a draft. I don't think they've even really started to develop that.
Is that the one that the statute says June of 2020?
It does, but
Whether the HCD will actually do that or not,
yeah,
I don't know.
there have been plenty of other times where such mandates are imposed, and then there's maybe a draft that might start to be circulated then. But ideally, we'll have a list, or we'll have a form soon. In the meantime, we've got the list of the requirements that we're allowed to ask about from applicants. And then once all of that information is provided, an applicant is deemed to have a preliminary application in. And from that, there's certain timing requirements of how long the applicant has to finalize that application, and then from there, there's further approval deadlines that are triggered.
One thing I want to point out is we've had for years a Permit Streamlining Act, which imposes timelines on processing permit applications. The Permit Streamlining Act has had limited teeth because it keys off of completion of the environmental process. And so the timelines don't begin to kick in until an environmental document is approved. I believe that is still the case here.
That is still the case, and none of this legislation seeks to in any way amend our obligations under CEQA. So environmental review is still necessary.
But it does impose some more specific timelines once you reach that point, and it re-emphasizes what we have always recommended, which is that you never approve an environmental document until the night that you're planning to approve a project. Because it is possible to approve an environmental document early, but if you do that, you begin now to count time under the Permit Streamlining Act. And those are fairly tight timelines for approval, and the conclusion, if you fail to comply with those timelines, is the project is deemed approved. So you really don't want to fall into the trap, which some jurisdictions have, of approving an environmental document and then continuing action on the project itself to some later date.
So another added complication to this completion of the preliminary application is that even if an applicant has submitted all of this information, that doesn't really lock in what that specific project is, because there's still 20% of wiggle room built into SB 330, where if an applicant decides to change the project a little bit to add 20% more units or add 20% more square footage, the application is still deemed complete, even with those changes being made after all that information is submitted to the town. And then apart from those 20% increases, if the applicant decides to include some more affordable units and is entitled to more of a density bonus than initially submitted on the list, then any density bonus doesn't count towards those 20%. An application could still be deemed complete, plus whatever units would come about through that change as well. And so another part of this is, part of the streamlined approval process here is that, and there's a little bit of confusion about this piece because it's very unclear in the law, is there's a limit to 5 public hearings on a project once the application is complete.
5?
5.
Is this for only ones with affordable?
No, this is for all housing developments that require public hearings. You're limited to have 5 public hearings, and that's not 5 times in front of the Planning Commission and then 5 times before the council. That's 5 public hearings total, in total. And because of the ambiguity in this, it's not clear that appeals don't also count towards that. That would be a somewhat ridiculous interpretation of this, to say that any appeal by the applicant would count towards that 5 meeting limit. But it's not clear from SB 330 that it isn't to be read that way.
So we should point out one point of ambiguity. the way the statute is worded, it makes a specific reference to a provision in the planning and zoning law that governs conditional use permits and variances. And so you could begin to read it as, well, wait, this 5 hearing limit only applies to CUPs and variances. But it also goes on to say, or any other law, ordinance, or regulation requiring a public hearing in connection with the approval of that housing development project. So we'll have to see. It is possible that the idea was use permits and variances, fast process, no more than 5 hearings. General plan amendments and rezones, that's different. PDs, all those things, you still are unlimited on that. But unfortunately, it's not well written, and so that's a piece that's going to have to be teased out over time. But yeah, the statute is very clear. The definition of a hearing covers all hearings, any agency, planning commission, council, any committee that you create. You have to sort of take a step back. The goal in all of this legislation was to address what was decided by the legislature as a problem at the local level, that local governments and local communities are the holdup for development of housing. And so the legislature has gone to extensive lengths here to try to capture all of that and to say no tricks. You can't suddenly create a process where you give the manager a responsibility to have 6 hearings, or create a new committee that's called something other than the planning commission. It's like, hearing is a hearing, and any of them. It doesn't matter whether it's a workshop or whatever, it's all of them.
What about a continued meeting? Yeah.
Each one counts as a meeting.
Each one counts separate. They specifically address that continued meetings are separate.
So we did,
How many did we do?
19.
we had several with the village where
19.
we knew ahead of time that they didn't have anything ready for us, so it was automatically continued
Well,
because it
with
was.
that, I mean, that's what you'll have to fix, right? We'll have to, but
have a
we had
meeting till
19
everything's ready.
hearings for the village
Everything's got to
project.
be right there.
But some of those, there
between-
was nothing but, there was no
But
meeting.
most of them were not.
nothing.
Most of them were public meetings at which the project was
Is this
discussed.
five after the environmental things, if we got into something that had sticky
Nope, nope.
environmental issues?
5 hearings.
5 hearings once
Including
the
any
application.
environmental things?
5 hearings.
When does this go into effect?
January 1st,
Woo, okay.
2020.
Including
So a couple weeks.
I mean, there's, with any legislation, there is ambiguity in almost every piece of legislation.
that's just how.
This is
My
just-
personal opinion, the legislature has gotten much worse over the years that I've been practicing law in writing bad legislation that is not clear. That's just my personal opinion. And
Rumor
so,
has
but
it
the,
they're
but
already
the attitude of the
fast-drafting.
legislature has historically been, well, we'll let the courts figure that out. So that's what will happen. Or more likely, for some of these, there will be legislation this year that will be introduced to clean up certain things. I haven't heard anything specifically about this point.
There's a lot of buzz around this 5 hearing thing that there needs to be some clarification, but that's coming from kind of our constituency at the local level rather than anybody at the state
So
level.
the good news is, because there's ambiguity, we can argue that there are more hearings that may be appropriate under certain circumstances, but it's pretty, yeah.
Spelled out.
So if the applicant requested a continuance, we might just say, no, we can't
Yes.
afford to give up one of our 5 hearing
Right,
days.
because there's nothing in this that indicates the applicant has the power to waive
Yeah.
that limitation.
Which would be another way to get around this. If they had that latitude built in here, that would be one way to
And this
draw
is
this out a little further.
Any kind of housing, just any kind of housing project.
It goes
kind
back
of-
to that definition I had up a couple slides ago about anything that proposes 100% residential use or anything where 2/3 of the square footage is residential.
Okay.
One other point that I wanted to make on the streamlining is that in handling applications, there's some very tight deadlines for requesting information where there's gaps, where an applicant didn't meet the checklist requirements or where some piece of information is insufficient. There's 30 days from once the preliminary application is considered to be fully received to notifying the applicant of any deficiency. And that deficiency needs to be very clearly laid out. There can't be just, oh, we might need additional information, this doesn't look very good to us. Statute requires that you very clearly line out what you still need from the applicant.
Does this, the January 1st rule, what about things that are in process? Or, I mean, not that I'm just saying.
And actually, as I'm reading this a little more closely, it does say general plan and zoning is excluded from that. But, so it's really conditional use permits and variances and other actions like that. So a village-type project would not be subject to a 5-hearing limit, I think.
Would not, no.
Yeah,
But
but,
not, and why is that, Jeff? I missed it.
well,
I'm sorry.
because
It's
I'm
a general
reading,
plan amendment.
so I'm reading the follow-on page that says a hearing includes all of these things. Hearing does not include a hearing to review a legislative approval required for a proposed housing development project, including but not limited to general plan amendment, specific plan adoption or amendment, or a zoning amendment, or any hearing arising from a timely appeal of the approval or disapproval of a legislative approval. So that would suggest that the question on appeals, if it's a use permit, it is counted within that. Because it's specifically saying you don't count appeal hearings on a legislative action. So,
But that still leads to the result of if you've already had 5 hearings, so is there no appeal then because you can't have a 6th on the CUP?
don't know.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of room here. Keep in mind that this is a 35-page bill.
Wow.
A very dense language. It's layered on top of years' worth of revisions. I've never had, for example, I've never seen a statute that refers to sub somethings. I mean, because you're down to, A1, B1, C, whatever the various little things. So it's, we have tried to condense all this into tonight's presentation, but obviously, even with Andreas and I both looking at this, there are some things that we're still going to be learning about.
Okay.
So if you've got 5 meetings and the project's a mess because it's not enough time, so you deny the project.
That's
now
what you do. You
You
deny
start
it.
all over again and you get another 5 meetings, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the applicant submit a new application. But typically, when a project is denied, the result is the application that's closed out. So you submit a new application. Now, you could submit the same application
Right.
again.
Yeah.
It could have the opposite impact then, could bring on denial.
Yeah. Could have,
Then we're gonna lose the luxury of hearing from the same people again and again with the same issues.
Michael,
I'm not going to comment on that one.
scratch that.
I mean,
On the record.
again, keep in mind that sort of the overarching impetus behind this. A perception that there is a housing crisis, a perception that local government is at least in large part responsible. I think that's unfair characterization. Nevertheless, that the legislature's, the legislature does what the legislature does, which is to see problems and then say, it's clearly not us, so it has to be someone else, and it must be local government. You must be the responsibility for this. The other thing to keep in mind, and I'll just editorialize a little further, when you look at the authors of these bills, all the bills that Andreas mentioned, almost all of them are Bay Area or LA authors. They're addressing Bay Area and LA and San Diego issues, except that they write them with a broad brush that applies equally to everyone. Mm-hmm. And so guess what? You get swept in to the bills that affect everybody. So we're going to talk about the definition of urbanized area. I don't know if we actually have a slide that
I don't think
talks
we have a
about that.
slide on it, but we can talk about that now that you mention it.
This applies to cities that are in an urbanized area or an urban cluster.
Yes.
Loomis is partly in that. A good chunk of Loomis, basically the center of Loomis.
It's north of Barton Road and north of Brace Road, south of the freeway. So everything that's north of those 2 roads.
And on the north side of the freeway are pretty much all of Loomis, north of the freeway and south down to Barton and Brace but those portions of Loomis that are not within that we don't know exactly what happens there, because the way this is written, the author assumed you're either urbanized or not. not that you're partly urbanized.
But when you
So-
look at the census map and you look at Loomis, there's
So one
large
interpretation
parts of the
is,
south of Loomis are not in the
you know,
Sacramento
you
urban
either
area.
are or aren't. The other interpretation is it depends on where the project is. And if it's south of Barton, then you're not subject to all this streamlining process, but we don't know. It's not clear.
You're also not subject to it if you have less than 5,000 people. So if you can drive out 1,800 folks from Loomis.
We're working on it.
Well,
Maybe you could-
disincorporate them.
Maybe there's a portion of Loomis you could de-annex and attach to
Yeah.
Rockwood.
I had a quick question about denials. There was some once, I think it was probably a conditional use permit, and they didn't meet what we wanted, and so but it was close. So I think the phrase was denial without prejudice. What happens?
Well,
What is that?
there's two possibilities. One is that it didn't mean anything. The more likely is that there's something in your zoning code which attempts to try to limit that. I don't know. I'm being a little flippant.
There was
but
something about they could come back, and it wasn't the same as a flat denial. You don't know
I would
anything
have
about
to
that?
look.
Okay.
I know that there are communities that have at least attempted to place limitations on the ability to sort of refile the same thing over and over again. I don't think you have that, Mary Beth. Do you happen to know?
I think this was an attempt to leave an opening for them to be able to come back
I
because
think
they were so close.
I know there are some jurisdictions that have said things like, in a situation like that, we would not require you to file a new application fee. But I don't know. I remember when that happened, but I don't remember now whether we have some effort. I would be very concerned with anything that we adopt locally that tries to say you only get one try, and if if your project is denied, you can't file again. But
Especially now in this landscape where Commissioner Hogan foreshadows a lot more denials because of the limited number of
And not an
meetings.
opposite impact on the
Yeah.
parade.
So maybe that even leaves room
Yeah,
for
the-
considering an ordinance that
the term
allows
unintended
for
consequence comes up a lot when we're
Yeah.
talking about the
Yeah, we're
legislature.
talking about legislation, yeah.
All right.
Okay, I'll get off my soapbox for a while.
So
I don't have an opinion about this.
as I started when I mentioned SB 330, there's a big focus on affordable units. And so here there's a very specific prohibition against denial of affordable projects unless there are specific findings that can be made, including health and safety issues. But not where there's just impacts that are caused by the amount of density, for instance, that'll be brought by an affordable project. Because that affordable project will have above the zoning requirements density because of the density bonus law. Impacts from that density alone are not sufficient to base a denial on. And then kind of jumping to the bottom before I go back up to zoning changes is violations here can be remedied with court orders to fix whatever the perceived violation is or the found violation is. And then fines for at a minimum, $10,000 per unit that was wrongfully denied by the local agency. So the legislature put a pretty heavy cudgel in here to try and get local jurisdictions to adhere to the requirements of SB 330. And then jumping back up to the zoning changes and the limits imposed on zoning changes by SB 330. Starting on January 1st, 2020, zoning changes that lessen the density of residential use are limited to whatever the residential zoning density was on January 1st, 2018. You're allowed to upzone as much as you'd like, but in effort to try and promote more housing development, you are not allowed to downzone below what the level was on January 1st, 2018, except for those instances where you're downzoning and offsetting the lost density by upzoning another parcel somewhere else in town. And so that last piece is something that's been overlooked a little bit in the coverage of SB 330, is that there's really kind of an out to that by allowing you to kind of offset zoning changes in other parts of town. And so with that, we've got, well, we've got a little bit more to talk about on accessory dwelling unit legislation. And the big bill on this was AB 881.
Do we want to pause here
We
and see if anybody has specific
Sure,
questions?
let's do that. Let's jump back to
Because
SB.
330 is the one that's probably the biggest impact. The ADU legislation can be significant, but I don't know if you've had a whole lot of push for accessory dwelling units. The ADU legislation taken together is intended to make it easier for accessory dwelling units to be built, to limit fees that can be charged, limit things like parking requirements and owner occupancy requirements, basically just efforts to make it easier for folks to build an accessory dwelling unit on their property. And at a smaller size, I think, down to 750 square feet.
For junior accessory dwelling units, but we'll get to that later. So right now, I guess we'll take questions
But
on SB
330 is
330.
the one that many people are concerned about.
Is there ever any talk about, when you have an accessory dwelling unit, right now I think the assumption is you can put one on your property. What if you have larger acreage? Will it allow you to put two?
Don't think so.
You
I thought
can
everybody
now
was
have an
supposed to
accessory
get
dwelling unit as
3
well as a
now.
junior accessory dwelling unit.
That's right.
So
A
you
junior.
can have the junior units are the smaller ones, so long as it's within the existing square footage of your either primary residence or the accessory dwelling unit that you are already considering. You can have up to 3 separate housing units on single-family zoning.
Okay.
Think Goldilocks.
What?
Think Goldilocks. You can have the Papa Bear, Mama Bear, and the Baby Bear.
That's gonna be so weird.
Okay.
Oh my gosh, little
Would
mini.
that
Mary
be
Beth.
applicable to, you have your house, your primary dwelling, your garage, you have a secondary unit, you can put a unit over the garage as that junior unit?
Well, that wouldn't be existing square footage then, that would be adding square footage to the existing structure. So the junior unit wouldn't meet the definition of the junior unit.
The junior unit requires a conversion of a garage?
It requires a conversion of existing square footage, and it defines existing square footage as any square footage in an accessory dwelling unit or the primary structure on a lot.
So if you use my house as an example, I have a detached garage. So if I converted the detached garage, that would be a junior. If I added a second story on, that would be the Mama Bear.
If the junior unit still meets, I think it's 750 square foot requirements, unless you have a really large garage.
Yeah, no, my garage is not that big.
So what happens to the requirements that we have covered off-street kind of parking, those kind of,
Anything that's in conflict with what this law says is ineffective.
We'll need to look at the specifics of I don't remember what's in yours in terms of parking requirements. There was a concern that communities were requiring too much parking for ADUs. I don't remember what your requirements are, so we can look at that and see.
And there's also a new distinction that's created here in this set of bills this year is for parking requirements that apply near transit stops versus major transit spots. So there's a definition for transit stop here that includes any bus stop versus major transit stop, which has more stringent timing requirements for how often the public transit needs to stop by for a radius within, which from there's a separate requirement for what can and can't be required as far as parking goes. But since Loomis does, I believe, have bus stops, there's going to be certain parking requirements that take effect just because of that.
Yeah, and
We'll have a multimodal transportation facility. We're sitting in the middle of it right now.
So it'll be interesting because one of the difficulties that many jurisdictions face is that money for housing, including affordable housing, is often linked or significant points are given if you are located in proximity to transit. And so I don't know whether there's been any linkage between a sort of a looser definition of what transit means with any of the funding to see whether or not, that was attractive, but to make more funding available in communities that don't have light rail or don't have a really developed transit system like that.
Yeah, so in all of this, there wasn't a ton of funding that was provided in any of these bills. So I don't think that any of these changes, changing the definition of transit stop to include any bus stop, also touched on existing funding sources.
We were talking about this earlier, when you consider that I've seen estimates to say that the unmet need for affordable housing in California is in the neighborhood of trillions of dollars, and the state produces $1 billion and says that that's the state's contribution to developing affordable housing. $1 billion is a big number, but not when it's compared to trillions.
So are there any other questions on SB 330 before we move on to the specifics about the ADUs?
I'm a little concerned about the zoning changes.
Yes.
So as we're doing our general plan, how does that affect us changing the general plan?
Well, in the big picture, we're not allowed to lose zoning density or residential density, because we've got this offset kind of mechanism where if we make zoning changes, we'd have to, if we downzone one thing, we'd have to upzone something else. Exactly.
So
Yeah, I think that's the biggest takeaway from that, is the
upzone it, but not downzone it.
Right, and so to the extent that you've got locations, you'll have to pair decisions. And in the context of a general plan land use element, for example, you'll be looking at it that way. We'll need to be seeing no net loss is the key word.
Okay.
That if you're going to, and this is, just to be clear, this is separate from the existing laws that address affordable housing sites. So we've already had law on the books that says if you have identified locations within your jurisdiction to meet your RHNA numbers, so you've identified them as at the high enough density to be what the state determines is sufficient to allow for the development of low and moderate income housing. You already had rules there that say you can't downzone those, right? You can't allow development to occur there at a lower density than what you had identified. This sort of expands that now to cover all residential, not just affordable housing sites.
All residential.
And residential by the definition that was laid out earlier, where it's not just purely residential zones, but also zones that allow for 2/3 residential use.
And also, to be clear, when they talk about, they don't specifically talk about zoning, they talk about development standards. So development standards includes a whole laundry list of things, from the allowed density, the setback requirements, building heights, lot coverage requirements, a number of standards in here that are sort of grouped together as development standards and policies, and that you can't change those in a way that reduces the allowed intensity of residential development, which we all read as a substitute for density, even though they talk about density also. So a little unclear what intensity means, different from density, but.
So we have setbacks that we don't have to change those necessarily, except there's now a 4-foot.
Yeah.
Applicable to ADUs, yes.
Well, even in the limitations on adopting development standards that reduce intensity, when they list what constitutes those development standards, they include a lot of.
But do we have to change the ones that we have as long as we don't reduce them?
No. This is talking about making changes to them that
Okay.
reduce in density. Right.
Except that the 4-foot one for the ADU.
Yes.
Trumps
That one takes effect
Trumps
automatically.
everything
There's no
else.
change
Yes.
necessary for that one to take effect,
Right.
along with the lot coverage requirements that kind of are tied to that as well. 4 foot, yes.
I knew you'd catch that, Gene. I knew it.
That's the only one of these laws that I actually read the whole thing.
That's not very much.
So with 4
Especially
feet,
for a town like ours.
you won't need much of a running start to jump from roof to roof.
Yeah. You say hi to your neighbors.
Pole vault right over there.
Fire department used to want 10 feet separation between
Yeah.
them.
Or a firewall. Some new communities will make an exception for a reduced setback if you build a fire
Between the units?
Yeah,
Yeah.
a firewall between the units.
That makes sense, yeah.
Right.
Huh.
Were there any other questions on SB 330?
I'm sure
Is that
that'll
also
come up.
5 years applicable?
No, the 5-year thing is only applicable to the owner occupancy of ADUs.
Okay.
No, unfortunately, they didn't put a sunset provision into these requirements.
Although within this, there's a lot of these sections have 5-year limitations. Some of them have 5-year limitations. But, yeah.
But generally speaking, this
Right.
is permanent.
We haven't had any owner occupancy requirements for ADUs that I know of.
No, I don't think you do.
No, that's a common tool in some other jurisdictions where there's either a requirement that the owner occupy the primary residence or the accessory unit, just to make sure that somebody's not just taking a single-family lot and essentially turning it into rental stock and putting as many units on there as possible to maximize revenue. So moving on to the ADU laws more specifically. AB 881, that's where our 4-foot setback requirement and the elimination of the minimum lot coverage limitation, or the maximum lot coverage limitations comes in for ADUs. And again, just to distinguish this from some of the other changes, this one takes effect January 1st, regardless of what your current ordinances require. There used to be minimum unit sizes for ADUs, and this kind of gets rid of that requirement by creating this junior accessory dwelling unit kind of separate category, where the junior units don't have a minimum unit size. So you could conceivably have like a tiny home as a junior unit, as long as you've got it within your existing floor space. Eliminates parking requirements for ADUs that are within half a mile of public transit, and that's not a major public transit stop, that's within public transit. And it takes away for 5 years, as we already talked about earlier, the owner occupancy requirement. Now, important to note there is that short-term rental bans are not affected by this. Short-term rentals can still be regulated just as they have been up to this point.
As in like Airbnb? Is that
Exactly, yeah. So a short-term rental is
We
one that's
may need
defined
to
as
look
30
at
days
that.
or shorter,
right? Okay, 30 days or shorter.
30 or 31 days. It's one of
We
those.
have that kind of a ban.
We don't have any kind of short-term rental.
That's one of my comments, that we need to look at that.
Because it's very popular. I know people that are doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, and Carol was saying that we collect TOTs on that kind of stuff, but we don't really have anything in place for regulating it.
Yeah, so we probably should think about that.
Or the abusive one, like we had 2 years ago, that was turned into an supposedly Airbnb that was actually run as an event center.
Oh, good. Okay.
With the former horse pasture, could accommodate 40 to 50 cars at a wedding.
And it was her neighbor.
That's my neighbor.
Oh, my goodness.
They're gone, we have nice neighbors there now.
So short-term rentals kind of made the legislative cycle a couple years ago, and all of those changes that were made as far as what regulations can be imposed on those are unaffected by this more kind of favorable status that's given to ADUs. AB 671, there's now a requirement that there is some promotion or incentivization of the development of ADUs, and especially affordable units in the housing element. We don't have a whole lot of detail on what kind of incentives or what kind of promotion that would be, but something that we'll have to take into account when we're drafting our housing element here. And there's also supposed to be a database of grants that are available for affordable units, for the development of affordable units. And so that's good information to have. I don't know how readily accessible that is now, but in a year from now, HCD is supposed to have developed that inventory of grant funding sources. Not that there's additional money that came with this bill to kind of seed that database.
So how and when does an ADU get to count at all? Or is there a way that it counts toward any of our RENA or other affordable housing requirements? How would it, do they count or they don't count at all? Or
If it's deed restricted, if it's proposed as an affordable unit,
That would certainly, you'd certainly be able to count that
Yeah.
if it was deed restricted.
Deed restricted for, is
But if
that
it
the
wasn't-
30-year thing still?
I don't know that it has to be for a particular period of time. I'll have to
I'm
look
not
at
sure
that. I don't
about that
remember
either.
now.
but short of that, I don't know how you would prove up whether an ADU would satisfy that requirement or not. Since ADUs tend to be kind of a one-off or now two-off junior units.
And if they're built for, actually, as
I
a
mean-
mother-in-law kind of place,
I
they
mean,
may
they're-
not be charging
right.
them rent at all.
Well, and there is this push to encourage the development of ADUs as a type of affordable housing. Remember that there's, affordable capital A and affordable small a. Affordable capital A is the rent-restricted regulatory agreement recorded against the property kind of. Affordable small a is just places that are more affordable than others. So I don't know. It's a good question. There's been a lot of ADU legislation over the years. Probably want to confirm that maybe that was something that was addressed in some previous bill. Because in the past, many years ago, HCD was very reluctant to count anything as satisfying your RENA number unless it was restricted. That it was, that was kind of it. But you would think that with this push to encourage ADUs, there'd be some recognition that, well, then we should be able to get some credit for that.
Maybe especially the tiny home, the small, the junior, I mean,
The junior units, yeah.
junior
I
units.
don't know, that's a
Interesting
good
question. Are there any other questions before we move on?
One thing I did want to point out, not to open a wound, but these limitations on changing development standards, for example, extend to actions by initiative and referendum. So an action by initiative or referendum is subject to the same limitations. You cannot change the development standards to reduce intensity without a no net
Offsetting
loss
elsewhere.
thing somewhere else, which would be very difficult to do by initiative or referendum. So, and what does it mean to do it by referendum? I don't know exactly, since a referendum is is reaction to an action taken by the legislative body. But one could think that a court would tell you that a referendum that results in a higher, that results in a reduction in allowed density would be a referendum that would fall afoul of this. So, no. The other one I wanted to point out specific, because we were going to talk about some examples. We talked about whether we use some real-world examples or some hypothetical examples. We're prepared to talk about whatever you want to talk about in examples, but I did want to point out, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the village project because I know there's been some discussion of the fact that there's now an inconsistency between general plan and zoning. However, I believe, if I remember this correctly, and Andreas, you can speak to me, that the fact that the zoning is inconsistent with the general plan, you cannot require an amendment to the general, can't require an amendment to zoning if the zoning requires a lower density than the general plan. In other words, you cannot deny a project because your zoning and general plan are inconsistent, as long as it's consistent with the general plan. So in the village project, the inconsistency, arguably at least on part of the project site, is that it allows residential development in what the zoning code says has to be general commercial. And I think, if I'm reading this correctly, you would not be able to require a developer to do a zone change in order to make the zoning consistent with the general plan, if they came in with a project that was consistent with the general plan designation.
Yeah, you would have the consistency and you're not allowed to.
Normally, the answer, the general answer is zoning and general plan to be consistent. And if they're inconsistent, you have to amend, and it's typically phrased as you have to amend your zoning to make it consistent with the general plan. But before this, there was nothing that stopped you from amending the general plan to make it consistent with zoning.
But the
They just
general
have to be
plan
consistent.
supersedes the zoning.
Yeah, but you can fix that inconsistency in either way.
Yeah.
This would suggest that where the discrepancy is that the general plan allows greater density, you could not change the general plan to bring it up to the zoning, and you couldn't deny a project on the grounds that it needed a zoning change to bring the zoning down to where the general plan is.
Yes, because the applicant could rely on the higher density that's in the general plan as kind of the basis. as
So
the baseline.
whichever one has the lower,
Higher density.
the higher densities sticks, no matter whether
Well,
it's the general plan or the zoning?
I know I made a note about this in here, and I'm not finding my note, so, sorry. Bear
We
with
started
me.
with the tricky example here.
I know, I started with a tricky example. A proposed housing development project is not inconsistent with applicable zoning standards and criteria and shall not require a rezoning if the housing development project is consistent with the objective general plan standards and criteria, but the zoning for the project site is inconsistent with the general plan. So
if you've
that's
got-
the situation we have with the village. The village site is there's an inconsistency between general plan and zoning. And this will tell us that beginning January 1, you cannot require a rezoning, so long as a proposed project is consistent with the general plan. And where that potentially becomes relevant is in the part we were talking about 5 hearings. If you don't have to change the general plan and you don't have to change the zoning, and all you need is a map or a use permit, you may be limited to 5 hearings.
For what could be a very large project.
Yeah, that sounds like.
But we could, that's only if a project is
Consistent with the general plan.
coming in.
Yeah.
In other words, if we wanted to fix it before there's a project, as long as
But
we
then
don't,
you're gonna-
as long as we don't downzone
If you
something.
don't downzone.
Yes.
Or if you rezone something else, change the general plan and zoning somewhere else to balance it,
Accommodate.
so there's no net loss. So yes, as part of a general plan process, you could decide, we want to put the village site back to general commercial, but we're going to offset that by changing a designation somewhere else to increase the density in that other location. I don't know where that location would be, but if there was some other location in
It's
town.
not even feasible to achieve the densities of the zoning for the village when you take into consideration the setbacks that we require. It's not practical to build a
can't.
home.
You can't build
Say
it.
there was some 10 units per acre, but then you go and say, well, you got to be set back this many feet in the back, you got to be set back this many feet in the front, this many feet on the side, and this many feet on the sides. You have no building envelope left, or almost none.
Well, you
So-
got to take
And I
out
see
the
that
streets and things
as
too.
inconsistency
Well,
between
and
those two.
that's what I was going to say. You have put your finger on one of what will be many points that are difficult to know exactly what was the intent and how it will be interpreted. One could be just what you're saying. If the general plan allows a certain density, but under the existing setback development, let's just call them development standards. Under
Yeah.
existing development standards, there's no way you can do that.
We have
What happens?
We have
Can
that
you
problem.
override?
big time.
Can
I
you
did the
override
math
those
on
development standards?
multiple
Because you
lots.
have to allow.
I did too.
Not built.
I did
And
too.
isn't that what they're trying to fix right now, is because we have this imbalance of all that?
Yeah.
Now, the caveat to that is if it's an affordable project and we've got our modified setback requirements,
Oh, so just.
then a site like that might
If
become,
it's affordable, then they have the whole
So,
set.
leading with this as an example, I apologize that we're probably resulting in more confusion rather than less, but the point I'd like you to walk away with is there are a lot of changes. There are some confusing ones and some ones that are ambiguous, and we're going to have to navigate our way through them, perhaps with some guidance, but initially without much guidance. Whether the things that we've identified or we identify here are ones that rise to a level where the legislature feels that this is, they hear it enough from enough people that they say, I guess we need to fix this one. Because this was such a big piece of legislation that it will not be surprising at all that there's legislation this year to try to explain some of what they did last year.
So you'll just have to, before we see a project come to us, it'll all be taken care of, right? So we're just looking at the real deal. That would be right.
Okay, is there any public comment? All right, okay. We're good.
Any questions from Anders?
Me too.
Okay.
Okay, I have a couple more
Oh, go ahead.
questions, but I'm not sure exactly where they belong. Now, it sounds like mixed use has to call it mixed use, has to have that 2/3 residential?
Yeah, the 2/3 of the square footage.
And is that only if we're doing it for affordable housing, or?
No,
Or
to,
what?
to meet the definition of housing development project, that 2/3 requirement is where that comes in.
Right. In other words, you don't have to change a definition of mixed use to make it 2/3 or more, but if it is, but for it to receive the protections under this, mixed use has to allow 2/3 of it to be residential.
Okay.
So if it's,
If it would be half and half, it would be one story of residential on top of some retail, that wouldn't meet this residential
Yeah.
Right,
requirement.
That's what it was going to be.
right, that's what, and that
Taylor
was
Road mixed use.
Taylor Road mixed use. So what happens when something's already, a Taylor Road mixed use project is already approved, then we have to tell them,
no, it's fine. It's just that we're talking about under what circumstances does a project receive the protections that are being added here. It's not that you
Okay.
can't approve it. You can approve
Okay.
it, as long as your own standards are met.
But the requirements imposed under 330 wouldn't apply.
Right, the limitations on your ability to change development standards kick in for housing development projects as defined, and those are residential projects and mixed-use projects where 2/3 of the floor space is residential.
so if they don't care if they get those protections, then,
Right.
It's
And if they've
okay.
got an approved project, you can't
They-
change the rules on them.
okay.
I don't know what the approval is. Use for bid or-
You mentioned the density bonuses. Is there any percentage, or does it kind of vary, and it varies with what's going on?
It varies with what percentage of affordable housing you're doing. And I think with 100% affordable, you get a 100% bonus.
Ooh, wow.
And the height restriction goes way up too. I forget how many feet more of height you get. Yeah.
Plus an additional 30 feet?
Oh, my goodness.
So the point of that was to really push 100% affordable development as being enticing to developers and to make those feasible on a lot more lots.
Or to put it another way, it's to prevent you from stopping those developments from occurring.
Or that way.
So we're probably going to see that.
So we have 3-story is our limit on our current
So they can go up to 6.
designated area.
That's correct.
So they can go 6.
Yeah, 30 feet, that's roughly 3 stories, right? Yeah.
You get a beautiful view of Loomis from the top floor.
Instead of from the old water tower the kids used to
The
climb.
reality, though, is that it's going, unless there's some benefactor who shows up, you don't have any money to support an affordable housing project. And you can't, I don't know any community in the state of California where someone can build an affordable housing project without some assistance from the local, because tax credits and other state and federal funds somebody's going to have to figure out how to do it. But right now, it's very difficult to build an affordable housing project without money from the community. I'm not going to say never, because as sure as I say that, someone will show up and show you how to do it. But it's hard to make them pencil, even with a significant contribution from the community. And
With a 100% affordable project, it's hard to make it up in volume, so.
yeah, 6 stories is great, but it's like painting your fence when you're running out of paint. Painting it faster doesn't make it, you're still out of paint.
Well, I was going to be kind of, one of my generalized questions, who is going to come and, who are we afraid of? Who would be coming in to build something like
Out here,
this?
you're going to deal with, I don't know, probably not going to have farm worker housing, because I don't think you have a lot of farm workers in the Placer area. Most of the affordable housing development is focused on the urban centers, because that's where the money is. That's where the state and federal, mostly state, and tax credit money is. So, I don't know, does Rockland have an affordable housing project?
Well, they approved one,
Yeah, I think they've
where the
got,
old
Kmart.
Kmart used to be.
Okay. And was there
It's a huge
Rockland, was there
project.
City of Rockland money in the project?
Probably.
I don't know.
Yeah, they've got the money to do it, so I imagine.
So I'm not, someone is going to have to figure out how to do that, because if the state is truly committed to making affordable housing happen, it's going to have to figure out how to not have to rely on the community to contribute $100,000 a unit, because
Actually, with center is $400,000 a unit, Mercy Housing is building it. But it's $400,000 a unit because they're also putting money into an enterprise or an escrow account to help maintain the building over its life.
but is that 400,000 total cost for the project?
No per unit.
Right. I mean, 400,000 per unit is the, yeah. I mean, that's a benchmark that I hear a lot, 400,000 as an estimate of the cost of affordable housing, 400,000 a unit.
Wow.
And you can't make all that up in tax credits and
No.
HP money. And
So I'm not sure how Mercy Housing has packaged that. I know the county gave them the land, I believe.
well, okay, so
And they got
there's
some state funding, and then Mercy Housing has some other funding.
Yeah.
So-
interesting. Anyway, we'll see. So it's at least a theoretical possibility here. I don't know if it's a real possibility.
Now with the cost of a housing unit like that, and kind of going back to something we talked about earlier, maybe that's where there will start to be some legislation on making affordable ADUs explicitly count towards your affordable housing numbers.
Right, because you could actually make that happen. Not in massive numbers, but could chip away at it anyway.
somebody that was in planning told me that one of the reasons that Roseville could put some money into their affordable housing is that they built so much housing that they were able, over years and years, when they're expanding so fast, to keep collecting those fees, and they had some matching funds that they could do it with, and that's not something that's likely to happen here.
I'm not familiar with Roseville's, but many jurisdictions have, if not an affordable housing component or requirement, mandatory inclusionary sort of housing, or a fee, an in lieu fee or a fee that's paid. And then the community collects that money and then uses it to bundles it together and contribute it for an affordable housing development project.
Now, one of the big things besides construction costs, and assuming even you had the land, is the costs we're still going to need for them to put in sewer or septic, and which means if it's septic, they've got to have space, and it has to perk, and they've got to put in presumably a well or water, and sewer if it's available.
Right.
The power electricity isn't as bad, although those hookup fees are, but to get into a sewer system or the PCWA water, if it's in town, that's like 40,000. What is it running, Mike? 40 something on a.
3/4 inch or 5/8 inch service. Last I checked, been a couple of years. It's about 14,000.
Oh, it's higher than that now. It's higher than that. Yeah.
If it's commercial, it's even more. I've seen commercial fees out of PCWA for a 4-inch service
ADUs?
in the neighborhood of 100 grand.
Yeah, so on ADUs, there are certain restrictions on what impact fees you can require and what you can require a separate connection for. So on ADUs, I think
Isn't there a requirement now that if you're putting in an accessory unit, you cannot charge another sewer hookup fee? You extend the sewer hookup that exists on the main structure.
So I didn't look at this very recently, but I think you're right. There was already in effect a restriction on what you could charge a connection fee for, and I think this year's legislation further kind of cut back what you can charge a connection fee for. And so that'll,
But that's not going to help you building an apartment.
yeah,
So,
that only applies to the single ADUs on a residential on a residential lot.
And
It's
we
not like
did-
somebody can propose a 30-unit development with affordable units and then not pay any connection fee for that. That's separate.
So that applied to the third unit too?
Yes, but that's because the third units are already within existing structures that would already have service.
Oh, well, they're not for all the extra people. I mean, you know, if you put a unit in your garage, that doesn't mean that your house was built or you paid the sewer company for extra people to be using that or the water.
Septic units are going to be an issue because they're sized by bedrooms.
Yeah.
And certain connection fees are also assessed based on fixture count, and so that'll also have an impact on how anytime that a connection fee is calculated based on fixture count gets to be computed, because then you might be in a situation where you're counting fixtures for a junior unit that's being put in, while state law doesn't allow you to charge a connection fee to that junior unit, so.
Is the state trying to get us to build these tiny little units rather than a granny flat of 1,500 square feet? I mean, are they trying to discourage the bigger?
No, they're just trying to enable more options so that different size lots, different preferences by homeowners are all suited.
Okay.
I didn't see any preference for smaller versus larger accessory units in here.
Now, one of the interesting things I just noted is that these limits on development standards apply to cities and counties.
Make it easier for more people to
In
build one.
Loomis, sewer service is provided by SP Mud and water by PCWA.
So that's the
by-
same kind of oversight that they had in the original legislation that limited the imposition of connection fees.
Yes.
And there was cleanup legislation for that very quickly afterwards.
That meant what?
That also applied it to special districts.
Because
where
right now, this
special
all that
districts
we've been
provide.
talking about on the limitations on imposing new development standards apply to cities and counties. Doesn't apply to special districts currently.
Because we just had, the sewer district just put in a very, very, very expensive sewer line, you know, under the freeway down to come through Turtle Island, connect with Rockland, and that cost them lots of money, which they're anticipating being paid back over time as their connections to it. So, you know, normally they would charge, you know, more for more units. And they, you know, they need their money back too. Now, I understand that already on the books was any surplus land that the town has, if they're going to declare it surplus and do get rid of it in some way, that already had to be offered for affordable housing, is that correct?
Yes.
Or some, there are
I
some
will
other
say
things,
that-
or it can be recreation,
Yeah.
or what, the community, commercial development or something,
Those
economic
rules
development.
were sometimes honored more in the breach because there was very little remedy spelled out for failing to do it quite that way. And there still is, so if you recall, the town recently sold or is in the process of selling the WW Molding property. That could arguably have been a site which the town would have had to run through the surplus land process, including the one that, a more robust one that comes into effect on January 1. However, there is also a separate, entirely separate body of law that allows the sale of land for economic development purposes.
Right.
And the new, as far as I know, none of the new laws that strengthen the surplus land rule overrules that other law. So the one that caught my eye was the one that basically looks like it's trying to say, look, every time you sell land, you have to either find that it is surplus and go through the surplus land process, or find that it is exempt from the surplus land rules. but it doesn't cross-reference this other body of law. So we're left with feeling like, well, I think that's still good law. You can still do these economic development sales. But yes, if we looked at other town-owned property that could potentially be used for other uses and you wanted to sell it, you would typically have to go through the surplus land process if it wasn't for an economic development purpose.
Is there, okay, the one that has the trade, the one you can trade, was it the ADUs? No.
ADUs.
What is the one that you can, you can't downzone, except you can trade?
Right, yes, you can,
The no net loss.
yes.
Can
That's a good term for it, the
Can
no
the
net loss.
town do that with anything, any property that they had? Can they-
Potentially, if you had property if you owned property that was not zoned residential, or was zoned residential and you were willing to intensify its, increase the density, for example, you might be able to trade off there. But if you have a piece of land that is zoned residential right now, and all you want to do is sell it to somebody to build it at the density that's allowed, that's not going to, you're not upzoning anything, you're not making it more dense. Thought you were going to ask the question of what happens if you take a piece of land that's owned by the town that is zoned residential and you want to use it for a use that's not residential. So,
If you were looking to do that, you would have to offset the density of
Yeah.
housing somewhere else.
You mean
Certainly.
like Heritage Park is zoned residential, but it's called Heritage Park?
For example.
the
For a
question
park?
would be if you, well, so that's a question. I think that if you, I don't know what your zoning allows. If you allow land that is zoned residential to be used as a park, is that an allowed use of residentially zoned property?
Spaces allowed in
All districts.
So if you didn't change the zoning, and all you did was allow it, was use it as a park, you might not run afoul of that. If you changed the standards, though, if you rezoned it from residential to open space, or rezoned it from residential to park, then you'd be running up against that.
Or it could just be sold as, there's a subdivision on it that can just...
Yeah, I mean, I know that I don't remember the details about the Heritage Park site. I know that it was property that was going to be a challenge to develop because of the configuration of the property and the existing pond on it. And so, I mean, I don't know that that was like shovel-ready land that somebody could just build a subdivision on, but
Well, it has an approved map, I think.
there's an approved map on it. It is mapped. You can go on Google and see the,
Yep. See the 40 parcels marked
not that
out.
I've done that recently, but
Well, I'm sure we will come up with a lot more questions
Okay.
as time
Yes.
goes on here.
and as long as you're
All
willing
right.
to accept the answer of, good question.
Okay, I
And
think...
if and when there's any cleanup, we'll of course bring that back to you guys for
We will
further updates.
try to keep track of this.
Okay, unless there's any last-minute comments or whatever, we'll move on to close that item. And next is Planning Director's report.
Yes, good evening.
Thank
Couple
you,
of things. Yeah, thanks
Very
for-
much, very
Good presentation.
very interesting, I think.
Couple of update items for you tonight. Costco, the re-release of the recirculated draft environmental impact report will hit the streets on Friday, the 20th. So it's noticed, it'll be available for pickup on Friday. It'll be on the website, all those things. But Town Hall will be closed after Friday. So
And you are open till 5? or
yeah,
5?
open till 5 on Friday. But then, and the library, the other place that it's available publicly is at the library, and it
They're
will
gonna be
also be
closed,
closed
too.
for the holiday. So it is available
Yeah.
online.
Will it fit in our box?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So you'll have your copies in your boxes.
Okay.
How early on Friday?
Probably Thursday before I leave.
Oh,
Yeah.
you're awesome.
So the re-release triggers, we calculated a 52-day comment period, which will end on February 10th.
February 20th?
10th.
To be clear, it's 52 days because the town has elected to extend the comment period by a week. So 45 days is the normal comment period, but because it's being released on the 20th of December, to anticipate concerns that will be expressed about the fact that you're releasing it on the 20th of December, we are extending it by 7 days.
The town has received another grant from SACOG, totally free, and we don't have to do a whole lot, but what we'll get from that is a couple of consultants, Michelle Reeves and another gentleman, that will do a downtown business plan with the business owners, kind of, you know. Michelle has recently done some things related to you know, like storefront improvements and stuff to just kind of spruce things up. So it's $20,000, and whatever bang we can get for that buck, we're going to do it. So we'll probably have some kind of presentation by them, report, something like that. So that'll be coming up. The former WW molding site, Loomis Mill Group, submitted their application this last month. It is out for outside agency review. Site plan design review for that site. 2 phases. First phase will be the brewery, market, bar, that kind of thing, outdoor eating area. The second phase comes in with the amphitheater and the stage and all of that kind of venue. So you will see that in January for consideration. Woohoo! Were you guys involved at all in the town flag contest?
I saw that.
Not really, no.
Yeah, so the council at the November 21st council meeting wants a little refinement, but that project's going forward. Talked about town hall being closed, and town manager Tuesday will be on hold until after the first of the year also. So we kept it short. Merry Christmas.
What's happening with Red's Bistro?
Oh, they're doing the interior work.
Okay.
SP Mud was out back last couple of days doing the sewer improvements.
They're progressing really well on doing they had quite a bit of extensive TI work to do on the inside. The whole re-roof, the HVAC system was shot. So it's turned out to be a little bit more costly than the owner was thinking. But we see him almost on a daily basis. Red comes in, so.
Awesome, okay.
So with the end of the comment period on, at February 20th, okay.
February 10th.
So we won't, or 10th rather, we won't see Costco until later February, is that right?
Yeah.
On our meeting again?
March.
March.
We put kind of a timeline up on the website. Okay. You have to write the final EIR, then you have to circulate the final EIR, and then it comes to you. So I really think you're looking the March, April time frame, and I think the final council would be in May.
I mean, it's reasonable to expect there will be substantial comments.
Yes.
We'll have to prepare responses.
Right, okay. Okay. All right. Okay, next would be commissioner reports, if any? No? Okay. All right. Then I think unless there's any other unattended business, we'll adjourn the meeting. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Good meeting.